Hey everybody, welcome back for another video. Today's video is going to be all about recommendations and specific recommendations for people who already like to read. So I have made a video in the past that is basically fantasy recommendations for people who consider themselves to be newbies to the genre. And I will link that video above, but those are more generic recommendations. Like if someone says, hey, I've never read fantasy, where should I start? Those are some fantasies I like to bring up into the conversation. But today's video is going to be specific to genres that people may already be comfortable with, familiar with, and they might come to you. I don't necessarily expect those people to be watching this video, but I personally get a lot of people coming out of the woodworks now that I'm really into reading and books and talking about my books. And they say, hey, can you recommend a fantasy book for me? I like to read thrillers. Or what would you recommend for someone who likes to read romance mostly? And so this video is for you guys to help make recommendations to your reader friends who you're trying to pull in to your web of fantasy. So I hope this video is helpful for you when you're making recommendations to your friends. So I went ahead and Googled like what are the most common genres for adult readers, and I jotted them down and then kind of off the top of my head came up with some recommendations that would be good for someone who loves those particular genres but is wanting to try something new. I personally mostly read fantasy, but I also like to read sci-fi, and I've been branching out more and more. And I'm trying to read, I like reading horror, but I've also been reading mysteries and thriller, and I'm kind of having a hankering lately for some really good, well-written romance. And so I'm constantly looking for good recommendations. So I figure people who love those other genres might be in the same situation where they're going, man, I keep seeing these shows emerging like Game of Thrones and Wheel of Time and Lord of the Rings, and they look interesting to me, but it's a big deal to pick up a huge book if you don't even know you will like it. So I thought this would be a good idea based on preferences your friends or family may already have, recommendations that you can have ready for them. Also, if you're a content creator and you want to use this concept like a tag video, I would love for people to add to this and expand on this list because I just think it's a pretty handy idea. So I'm going to jump right in. The only parameters I set for myself are I want it to be actual fantasy. So when I can, I'm going like swords and magic and that type of real fantasy, because the line between fantasy and like magical realism and paranormal and even sci-fi sometimes gets blurry, but I did try my best to stick with like actual fantasy recommendations. Please in the comments go nuts, tell me everything I did not think of. Of course, I only made recommendations of things I've actually read, not things that I've heard of that might fit the bill. So I am fully prepared for you guys to tell me everything I didn't think of, and I look forward to that. So I'm going to jump right in. The first thing on my list is historical fiction, which is a genre I am very interested in. And I kind of did that recently with The Alienist. And that is not fantasy, so I'm not going to add that to this recommendation, but I love that book and I'm very excited to hopefully read some more. But for historical fiction, I picked The Shadow of the Gods by John Gwynne. This is a series currently in progress, and the second book will be coming out soon. But The Shadow of the Gods is book one of his new series. And this book is not historical fiction, but he draws very heavily from Viking and Nordic history and lore. And so, man, if you are a fan of the show Vikings, this is going to be right up your alley. It's not the same, of course not, but it has a lot of those beats that we love from shows like the Vikings and The Last Kingdom, but it adds in like magic and beasts and stuff, which I'm like very, very into. So this book was awesome. I read it last year. It came out last year and I read it like the day it came out. It was awesome. So check this book out, and book two will be coming out soon. So if you are in historical fiction and if you lean towards like Viking stuff being like interesting to you, you're going to like this recommendation. And also I just love recommending John Gwynne anytime I get, because I think he is awesome. So the next category was romance, and I really struggled with this one because, like I just said, I don't read a lot of romance. I'm looking for romance recommendations, but I also don't really read much fantasy romance because it just typically doesn't fit what I like. And so I kind of am breaking my own rules already, because I think both of these books lean more towards magical realism. But I am going to go ahead and call them fantasy because I read them. They definitely have magic, and I do think they're great romance books that I would recommend to almost anybody who likes the romance genre. So I chose two. I chose Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern, The Night Circus. And I also chose The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue. So the Invisible Life of Addie LaRue is a story about a young girl in France in like the 1600s who is basically cursed, and she has to wander the world alone. And she is able to find love despite of the curse. So there's a lot of magic in this book. It was a book that as I was reading it, I was like, do I like this? It was different. It was definitely offbeat from what I typically read. But after I let the story settle and really thought back on it, it is something I really like. And it's a book that I wish more of my friends had read, because I would like to discuss it with people. But it was romantic. And not just in the fact that there was a relationship that was romantic, but the way it was written to me was very reminiscent of a romance novel. And with The Night Circus, and this is one I call definitely magical realism, and it's written in the early 1900s, and it's a magical circus. And the magical circus is the muse between two people who fall in love. So another one that I wish I knew more people that had read it, because I thought it was wildly interesting. The writing in it was just absolutely beautiful. Like, if you're a fan of gorgeous prose and stories that are just kind of like whimsical and magical, but also has some great characters and romance, I really think you will like The Night Circus. Okay, next on my list was science fiction. And for this one, I picked The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson. So this is book one of the Stormlight Archives. And if you are a fan of science fiction already, but want to dive deep into a big fantasy, epic series, then I think you will love the Stormlight Archives. This is a huge story, but definitely is a hard magic system that has a lot of rules, a lot of this does this if you do this, and if you add this, then you get this. It has a very technical magic system, and I think anyone who's a fan of big science fiction stories is going to love the way that this is presented. But also, it's a great introduction to fantasy because it is definitely a fantasy series. So we're not leaning so far towards sci-fi that we reach that line where it's like, is it science fiction or is it fantasy? This is definitely a fantasy series, but the way that the information and the magic system and the world is presented to you, I think would just be a slam dunk for somebody who loves fantasy. Horror is another one that I actually really struggled with to come up with a solid recommendation, because typically the type of horror I like, it's more leaning towards paranormal things, or just being left with a sense of dread and unease, and the atmosphere that's created through the telling of the story is what makes it so unnerving and therefore scary. And I couldn't come up with a true fantasy recommendation that is a book that gives me that same type of feeling as the horror stories I like to read. And so I could have brought in something like a lot of Stephen King books, like It, for example, because there's technically magic in that book, but is it magic or is it paranormal, otherworldly? Like, things are happening that aren't natural in that book. But that's not the type of recommendations I'm looking to make, because if someone likes horror, they've probably at least heard of Stephen King and It, if not already read it. So I went something that was a little more gore, blood and guts, just dark fantasy in general. And I chose Godblind by Anna Stevens. So if you like horror for the gore aspect, for the darkness and the good and evil and the blood and guts, I think you're going to like this book. This is a 3-book series. I've only read book 1 so far, but I really liked it. And there were several times I was just like, damn, this is dark. Or damn, that was bloody, that was nasty, that was hard to read. But it's not just there for shock value. Like, I think it was placed in the right places. It meant something. It was done for a reason. So it was a good story, a really good setup to what I'm hoping will be a fantasy series I love. But as a book itself, I definitely got strong horror vibes from it. Just not typically the type of horror I read. So this is one that I'm like, if you have any other recommendations for me for a true fantasy series or standalone that gives those horror vibes like I'm used to, that I'm looking for, please let me know, because that one was kind of a stretch for me. For the mystery genre, I chose Stormfront, which is book 1 of the Dresden Files by Jim Butcher. If you don't already know about this series, it tells the story of Harry Dresden, who is a wizard for hire in modern day Chicago, and he solves mysteries. So the story does grow immensely in scope and size and all that you can imagine. It's that and more. But in the beginning, it starts out as pretty clean individual case file. So this is definitely going to hit the spot for someone who's used to reading individual case file style mystery books. So this is a favorite series of mine. I could go on and on, but these are fun books to read in between big stuff or, you know, more serious things. But it does grow to be a massive story that is, his imagination just blows me away. And these early books, yeah, they get better as they go, but I still had so much fun with these early books. So if you like mystery books, I really think the Dresden Files is a great place to start. Another genre that is very popular for adult readers is thrillers. And no, I could not think of a fantasy series that felt just like a Harry Bosch or James Reese book or something like that. But when I think of thrillers, I think of the pacing, the action, the extreme like bingeability of them. So what came straight to my mind was the Riyria Revelations, and the book number 1 is called The Crown Conspiracy. But the way that these books are most typically acquired is through these 2-book volumes. And so book 1 would look like this for most people, called The Theft of Swords. It contains the first 2 books. Everyone knows these are favorite books of mine. Michael J. Sullivan is the author. And guys, these books to me read like a thriller. It is fantasy. It's definitely fantasy. It's epic fantasy. It's swords. It's magic. It's wizards. It's castles. It's dragons. It's all of that stuff. But it definitely reads like a thriller, in my opinion, because the action is kick-ass. The pacing is perfect. And it's one of those books that you just cannot put it down. It's such a page turner. And it's so consumable. It's so easy to read. And so for someone who is hooked on thrillers, I think Riyria Revelations, book number 1 being The Crown Conspiracy, which can be found in The Theft of Swords. I know that all sounds kind of confusing, but it's really not. Find The Crown Conspiracy, read it if you haven't already. I think those books are absolutely addictive. The next genre on my list is dystopian. So you guys, I have much love for books like The Hunger Games and Divergent, those series. I read those when I was in my early 20s and I absolutely love them. And I love what those books have done for reading in general. I feel like there are so many people in my generation who hadn't read a book since they were in high school or since they were forced to, but really got back into reading because of those series and those books. And so I have so much love for that genre and for those books in general. I haven't read them in a long time. I don't know that I'd read them again, but I would definitely still recommend them. I think they are fun books. As far as fantasy goes, I thought the perfect recommendation for someone who loves the dystopian genre is Mistborn. So this deals with a world where, imagine if the bad guys have already won and everyone who's left behind is just kind of at their mercy and living in this pretty dreadful existence. There really is no hope, but of course, you know, an unlikely band of heroes puts their head together and kind of comes up with an idea to turn things around into their favor. And the first book almost reads like a heist story. And Mistborn Era 1 is 3 books, and I absolutely love that story. It's something I hope to read again someday. After I finished Wheel of Time, it was one of the first things I read, and it was perfect for me because, like I said, it's not a dystopian story in the same sense of The Hunger Games or something like that, but it does give me that vibe, and that is my recommendation for someone who may really dig that dystopian genre or those series. And the last recommendation today is for the genre adventure fiction. And I'm assuming this means books like Treasure Island, Three Musketeers, Robinson Crusoe, those types of stories. So besides the obvious recommendation of The Lord of the Rings, which is the ultimate adventure fiction, I am going to recommend The Ember Blade by Chris Wooding. This book to me was the perfect adventure book. It had a little bit of everything. It has a prison escape, it has magical artifact, it has unlikely fellowship, it has a heist story, and it leaves you wanting more because it sets up a big story, but it also wraps it up really nicely in one book where you're getting a full story. And this is a book that I don't feel like it's talked about enough. I absolutely cannot wait for the next one. I just thought it was the perfect adventure and a really great underrated fantasy novel. So those are the recommendations I have for romance, historical fiction, science fiction, horror, mystery, thrillers, dystopian, and adventure fiction. So please let me know, what are some obvious ones that I may have forgotten? What are some recommendations you would add to that list? And also, are there any obvious genres I'm forgetting? Maybe this video needs a part 2. Thank you so much for watching, and happy reading, and more than anything, happy recommending. I really hope that you are able to take some ideas from this list and wrangle in a few of your other friends to read books with you, because as far as I'm concerned, one of the most fun parts about reading is reading with friends. So thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.